Are you tired of losing games to a tank differential? Whether you're a support, DPS, or even a tank differential is the easiest way to get a guaranteed loss. So in this video, we're going to talk about how you can counter every single tank in the game, what you should do to help your tank or win the tank matchup yourself, and tips and tricks to just start winning more freaking games. But do me a solid and smash that like and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and let's get right into the video. Now, the first character we got to talk about is Diva. And Divas don't necessarily feel dominant all the time, but a Diva can quickly become very, very difficult to deal with when they're eating fire strikes, they're eating ability spam, they're eating your nades, they're denying powerful plays, and they're kind of shutting down your team from making anything happen. Now, the biggest strength of Diva is that she can heavily punish positioning mistakes. If you're a DPS, if you're ever alone on an off angle, Diva can easily punish you, especially if your characters like Cass, Ashe, Hanzo, Widowmaker. These characters could get really easily pushed by a Diva and killed. And this is also true for supports as well. Realize that if you're ever isolated alone and a Diva is within her flight range, she can come after you, and you never want to be the person that gets punished. And also realize if you ever get hit by something like a nade or any sort of accumulation of damage like a dynamite, a Diva could pivot off of that and come after you, so your positioning needs to reflect that when it happens to be more passive, and imagine that a Diva could fly over and around to get to you. Now, from direct matchups, we do gotta talk about characters that can ignore DM. So characters like Mei, fairly good against the character. Zarya, fairly good against the character. Now, Diva can pick and choose her battles, so a good Diva player, especially on a high ground centric map, might not ever directly face you into your strengths, but at the very least, you can force the Diva away and deny her the value that she's gonna get on your team if she tries to fly in, because she's scared of your damage potential and she can't use her DM to protect herself. The last tip I'll give you up against the Diva is just to try to keep in mind her DM amounts. You're not always going to be able to perfectly track it, but if she's been DMing for like 2 seconds, she's not going to have much more DM, and you can actually make an engagement, make a play onto her or someone else, and realize that it's unlikely for the Diva to be able to put up that defense matrix. And if you pressure out a Diva, she puts up defense matrix and drops it, there's a window of time where she can't put up her defense matrix again, and you could take advantage of that for something like a nade, hypothetically. Now, the next character we got to talk about is Erisa. And the biggest reason why you're losing to Erisa most of the time is that you're focusing on this Erisa way too much. Erisa is kind of like the god at staying alive, never dying, playing on that front line, and just existing. So the majority of the time, if you're up against an Erisa, you typically want to try to find an off angle, try to find an aggressive angle where you can try to kill a DPS, try to kill a support. And this doesn't really matter what role you're on. You can do this from almost every single role. And unlike Diva, if you're on an aggressive off angle, especially like on the high ground somewhere, Erisa can't just pivot onto you out of nowhere. So you could be more liberal with your positioning, because the bodyguard punishing Diva is not there to punish you, and you need to be better at actually finding these characters in the backline that you can kill, so that the Erisa doesn't get an infinite amount of resources. Because if an Erisa bounces her cooldowns and gets perma-pocketed, she's just never gonna die, and you're gonna be caught shooting this Erisa non-stop. Maybe you have like a ridiculous amount of damage, but nothing's ever gonna happen. So impactful abilities in the backline, if you're a support, something like a nade in the backline, discords onto targets in the backline instead of discording the Erisa unless the Erisa's out of position. And from a DPS point of view, you're gonna look to try to take a far away aggressive angle to try to get a pick on one of the squishies in the backline, because you're trying to cut off the Erisa's form of sustain, aka her healing. Once the healers are dead, or one healer's dead, then you can think about focusing the Erisa, but before that, not so much. Now, as far as what tanks are good against Erisa, the best tanks, honestly, are going to be either a Winston dive, so something that can go past the Erisa, jump way past the Erisa, bubble off the Erisa's cooldowns, and try to go in the backline. That's typically gonna need some other divers with you. Or you play a character like Zarya that just gets full charge. You're 100 charge Zarya with 2 bubbles, then you can actually kill an Erisa. But I think every single tank can play against an Erisa if they play into their own strengths, and they don't necessarily play into Erisa's strengths. So a Sigma poking from distance, a Rein getting close range and trying to swing as much as possible, build up a Shatter, a Doomfist more or less ignoring the Erisa and trying to make impactful punches in the backline. You kind of get the idea. Now, next up, let's talk about Reinhardt. When you are losing to a Reinhardt, it can feel terrible. You're getting slammed all the time, a Rein swinging at you. So how do you beat a Rein? What do you do against a Rein? We need to recognize that Reinhardt is the most powerful character up close. If he's allowed to continually swing onto anybody, a tank, a freaking DPS, a support, I mean, he's just killing and doing so much damage so fast. So it's your job as whatever character you are, support, DPS, or tank, to make sure that you're playing your range. A Reinhardt should never be allowed to be on top of you, and that means that you have to play around charge in particular. This means that if you have cooldowns that can stop a Reinhardt charge, Maywall, nade, sleep, freaking boop, can boop them out of the trajectory and get some distance from you and Rein after the charge. There's a lot of CC abilities like Rock, Javelin. All these abilities should be preserved to counteract charge, because as long as you make sure that the Rein is not within a swing's range from you, you have an advantage in the fight against him. He's not doing anything. He's just existing. And as long as you deny him from getting on top of you, you'll win the matchup. You'll win against a Reinhardt. But what happens is players will throw their cooldowns too aggressively. They'll throw it out into the enemy backline, and then the Rein will pin in and you have nothing to react to the Rein. And now the Rein's in his effective range. You can't stop him. He's swinging in, and oftentimes good Reins will wait for you to use your cooldowns. So you need to be extra disciplined up against good Reins. And this is kind of how you try and play around and counter a Rein. Doesn't matter what role you are, this is true. Now, one thing I'll say is that when a Rein has Shatter, a lot of people are like, oh, we don't have a shield to block it, we're just gonna be dead, we're just doomed. A lot of the time, you need to spread out, distance, go on off angles, back up with range, play in a way that a Rein has to go for maybe a 1 or 2-man Shatter, as opposed to a freaking easy 5-man Shatter, because you are all stacking all together. Make it harder for the Rein. There's always ways to play around any ultimate, regardless of what ultimates you have to counteract or what abilities you have to counteract, simply with your positioning. Now, the next character we got to talk about is Roadhog. Now, if you're losing to Roadhog in the tank differential and he's just kind of running through your team, most of the time it comes down to a lack of communication. The Hog is kind of around, he's in the back line, no one's really keeping track of him, no one has the freaking headphones on, and the Roadhog is getting a lot of free value. As long as multiple people are stacked and there is an ability response to a Roadhog, there should be no problems. And it's really important that you also know when a Hog has breather and you play around canceling his breather with CC, not necessarily starting off with a CC and then not having anything for breather. So if you're Erisa, Hog's out of position, you shoot at him, shoot at him, shoot at him, wait for the breather, cancel the breather. Same thing with any other type of CC, Rock, freaking Sleep Dart. It doesn't really matter what the CC is. You're waiting for that Hog to be forced to use breather and then you're canceling it. And really, Hog is not a problem as long as you keep track of his position, ping him as much as possible, make sure that you're aware of where he's at, and keep in mind that on his hook cooldown, he's going to be periodically going for things again and again and again. When he doesn't have hook, you can be way more aggressive. When he has it, you need to focus on trying to deny it or dodge it. Now, as far as tank matchups up against Roadhog, I think the vast majority of tanks have some game against Roadhog. Characters like Diva can deny hook, although she can get hooked herself, so you're typically going to want to still play cover. Erisa is just like Hog's worst matchup. You can just keep freaking skewering him and canceling everything. Sigma is actually really great against Roadhog. You just play your range and play cover. Never let the Roadhog get close. And just keep poking him out, and he's going to be forced to breathe. He's going to take a lot of resources from his team. It's pretty simple. Reinhardt, you just want to get close range, as with everything. But the next character is Sigma. And a lot of the time, the biggest complaint I hear about Sigma is from DPS players and support players, where the Sigma is just like kind of ignoring your tank, pushing into your back line. And Sigma is really strong in that regard, where because of his shield and his high amounts of damage, he can kind of just push up on squishies and not even care what they're doing. You're never going to beat a Sigma when he has all of his abilities, full health, and a shield in front of him, constantly dealing damage to you. Now, there's several things that Sigma's really bad at, and one of the biggest things is that Sigma wants to play in a very linear fashion. He wants everything to be in front of him. He doesn't want something to be behind him. So dive characters are really good against Sigma. Characters like Tracer that can be behind Sigma, forcing Sigma to turn around, focus on multiple sides of him. Really, really great stuff up against Sigma. Now, the other thing on Sigma that's important is being on the same page as your team. Are you trying to shoot at the Sigma shield and shoot at the Sigma to force his cooldowns and force them to be reserved? Are you trying to ignore him and focus the enemy backline so that the Sigma doesn't have resources? How are you trying to play? What are you trying to do? Pings really help. Some amount of communication is very, very important up against Sigma. In addition to that, if we talk about specific matchups, for tanks, I think the majority of tanks can be good or bad against Sigma, depending on how you play that matchup. Sigma is very, very good from range, and he has that effective range that he wants to play at all times. And whether you're playing Rein or Erisa or pretty much any character, it's about denying his effectiveness from that range and setting up engagements that are favorable for you. Something like either ignoring him or challenging him as Rein, and it's oftentimes going to be very map specific. Sometimes the best counter to a Sigma on a good map for Sigma is just to mirror the Sigma, unfortunately. Now, the next thing that we got to talk about is Winston. Now, if a Winston is dominating your team, of course, there's the easy ones from a DPS point of view. Characters like Reaper, really good against Winston. On top of that, from supports, you know, characters like Moira are not going to get dove as easy. Characters like Brig are going to be able to deny the Winston and constantly trigger Inspire. But even outside of those characters, the most important thing about a Winston is making sure that there's a quick reaction to this character, very similar to the Rein example where you conserve cooldowns and then you have them to respond when a Winston comes out and explodes onto the scene with his bubble and jumps in. So for instance, if I'm freaking Ana and I throw an aggressive nade and then the Winston jumps in and I don't have nade to use on him instantly, then that is going to probably just end up in me getting killed. So having a responsive ability, and this is true if you're Sigma, this is true if you're any character with the CC or any responsive ability, it's going to be best to use in response to the Winston as opposed to trying to use it prematurely, because you got to realize that the Winston needs to be on top of you to be effective. So that's what you're waiting for, to be reactive to that. And then besides that, you need to know when he has Primal Rage. Now, this doesn't mean that you don't focus a Winston when he does have Primal Rage, because oftentimes you want to force out the rage early. You don't want him to not have to use it. But most of the time, if you do know he has it, you're not going to all in him. You're not going to go all in hoping to kill him and then you die because you used every single resource thinking that this Winston was dead, and he's just not. Now, the next character we got to talk about is Wrecking Ball. And if you're losing to a Wrecking Ball, there's a couple of reasons that it could be why. The first one is just focusing on this Wrecking Ball too much. Oftentimes, there are certain compositions that can deal with the Wrecking Ball with really high damage and CC, and there's some compositions that will never, ever be able to do anything to a Wrecking Ball. And you have to kind of understand what your composition is, and this is going to make the call, because the problem that happens, and the reason that Wrecking Ball gets a lot of value in ranked, is some amount of people focus the ball, some amount of people realize that the ball is not going to be killable, and then everyone's just being less effective. And if you're trying to play against the ball, sometimes you just need to do enough to get the ball away, and then you go on to do something else. You're not necessarily trying to kill the ball and overcommit to the ball. You're just trying to make the ball respect you and respect your damage to get away. Now, from the tank matchups, I don't necessarily think that there's any tank that has a crazy good matchup against Wrecking Ball. A lot of them are even. I think that Doom is slightly favored because you can cancel his slams if you time it right. Characters like Diva are fairly good because you can peel a lot of his damage and peel and defend against a lot of the hit scan fire that comes into his slams. Characters like Erisa can kind of give him a really hard time. Roadhog would probably be the best character at shutting him down. You can whole hog him into the wall and kill him that way, but Roadhog is so bad in the meta right now that he's just going to have a really hard time. And, you know, one nade, a slam, you could just kind of completely counter Wrecking Ball that way. Now, Wrecking Ball from a DPS point of view, and this is kind of going into two characters, Wrecking Ball and Doomfist, that have harder counters in the DPS slot than they do in any other slot, because Sombra is just a nightmare for both these characters. Sombra is really, really good shutting these characters down. You literally just wait for Wrecking Ball to engage into your team. You hack him as he slams, and now he's in your team hack. You're doing damage to him. Your team's doing damage to him. You denied his damage, and you can kind of pick and choose how much you want to focus on the Wrecking Ball. I think if you're focusing on the Wrecking Ball too much, you could just lose to the other members on the enemy team. But if the Wrecking Ball is their best player and it's really dominating y'all a lot, then it might be worthwhile. Now, from a support point of view, it's surprising, but characters like Zen putting a Discord on a Wrecking Ball in a high damage comp actually makes the Wrecking Ball killable and makes him respect your damage a lot more. Although if the enemy is full dive, it's going to be pretty hard for you to stay alive. In addition to that, characters like Brig are really good against Wrecking Ball, constantly triggering Inspire and booping him away with your flail. And if you're like Ana, just sleeping the Wrecking Ball can get him off you, denying him and making him run away. Now, let's talk about Doomfist, because Doomfist is a character that feels very feast or famine. Sometimes you go up against a Doomfist that feels like he does nothing, like me, and then you go up against a Doomfist like Zebra, who just dominates your team. And the thing about Doomfist is a character where if you charge his power punch consistently, he's gonna destroy your team. He's gonna just dominate. And you can't always control whether or not your teammates have power punch, but you can control whether or not you know they have it and how you play afterwards. And you might be wondering, okay, how should I play if Doomfist has power punch? Well, a couple of things. One, if Doomfist has power punch, you do not want to be directly stacked onto your team because chain punch will hit you all. Two, it's actually better for you to play in slightly open space up against a Doomfist with power punch than it is to play up against a wall, especially because that Doomfist is going to just power punch you into the wall, insta-kill you, and then he can kind of go from there. And third up, you do want to track a Doomfist ultimate if you can, because realizing when he's going to all-in commit and realizing when he's trying to do something and then ultimate is very, very important. Now, just like with Wrecking Ball, like I said, Sombra's really good at shutting down Doomfist, and generally just discipline up against the Doomfist, making sure that you're never charging his power punch, and then recognizing when the Doomfist is actually killable, even when he's blocking. A lot of times the Doomfist will block at like 20% HP. They think they're immortal, but you can actually focus them down, ping them, shoot them, kill them. And keep in mind that if a Doomfist has to use his punch to get away, to live, he's wasting the power punch that he just got. So it's not that big of a deal. Now, from a tanky point of view, not many tanks actually pose a crazy threat to Doomfist. I would say that Zarya is very, very annoying because you can deny his bubbles, and you're going to want to look to peel a lot of the Doomfist engages. Sigma is very annoying on a lot of the sniper maps because there's just not a really clean engage for you. Close range maps, I think Doom has the advantage, but Sigma definitely has the advantage in those sniper maps. And then just all in all, with any of the tanks, there's sometimes where you need to focus on the Doom, and there's sometimes that you need to recognize that you can't stop the Doom and you need to pivot onto their backline. So like sometimes on Ryan you can pin the Doom, sometimes on Ryan you can swing at the Doom, but if the Doom is going really aggressive into your backline, you pulling back and trying to help your team, you're not going to stop that Doomfist, and you're going to allow the enemy team to just flood in and take all these angles. So most of the time as the Doom goes in, you're going to want to replace that space by pushing up on the enemy team aggressively and denying them, cutting them off with your shield, threatening a swing, threatening a shatter, because that's the only way to hope that your team survives. Because like trying to peel, you're not going to do anything, you're going to give up all the space, your team's going to die to the damage. So it's important that you need to understand that, and that's not just true with Ryan, that's true with any tank. Sometimes you need to give up space, and sometimes you need to challenge the space that the enemy tank is leaving and just kind of do the same thing that the Doomfist is doing. Now last up, let's talk about Zarya. When a Zarya is going crazy in your backline, there's a couple of things that could be happening. The first one is not the fact that the Zarya is getting shot, like her bubbles are not getting fed. A lot of times people will say that. Typically, it just happens because a Zarya is living. If a Zarya stays alive too long in between fights, this is a problem. Especially if like a Zarya like loses a fight and they get out with high charge, this is really, really bad. And a lot of times you need to make sure that you don't allow a Zarya to use a bubble as immortality. They have one bubble left and they're weak, break the bubble, focus the Zarya. And it's important to make that call. Of course, pings and focus fire is very important. Now, from a tanking point of view, what characters are good against Zarya? I think that every tank, if they play to their strengths, can do decent against Zarya. Like Diva, yes, has a bad matchup directly against Zarya in a brawl, but if you just play the high ground, play away from the Zarya, and then look for an opportunity to go on the back line and catch someone out of position, then you could be just fine. Reinhardt, of course, you don't want to swing at the Zarya when she has full bubbles, but if the Zarya is like not high charged or low resources, then you can easily force out many of her last existing resources and swing on her. Characters like Roadhog definitely have a hard time. Hog is pretty good against the Zarya, and ultimately, I think the best matchup against Zarya is probably Winston, being able to jump far past her and just try to basically ignore her, force her to play peel. Zarya doesn't necessarily play defensively as well, and unlike Doomfist, where she can kind of deny his entire value with one bubble, you can't really do that up against a Winston. Now, I wanted to make this clear that with all the brawl tanks, Ryan, Erisa, freaking Zarya, all of these brawl tanks are going to be really easy to shut down when you have Maywall. Maywall is like king against these characters. And Mei is one of the best characters that give you a tank differential or help aid to a tank differential. Same thing with Ramattra, by the way, which I wanted to talk about Ramattra. Ramattra is a character that feels kind of not that dominant until all of a sudden they like burst out and just start killing people. It's important to understand that if you can just do something to deny Nemesis form, that's value. Like, you don't have to do something crazy, but like, let's say you're Sigma and the Ramattra pops Nemesis, just rocking the Ramattra, denying Nemesis, that's value. Another thing that you need to consider is that regardless of the role you are, the character you are, if Ramattra has your ultimate, you need to 1, play your ranges, and 2, conserve your cooldowns. Something like a sleep, a boop, a rock, a freaking, you know, even an aggressive flank in response to a Ramattra ult, trying to do something very similar to what I talked about with Reinhardt and Doomfist, but maybe you're a Cass and you go on an aggressive flank, because not only are you leaving the Ramattra range, but you're trying to make up the damage and the value that the Ramattra gets. Oftentimes, if the supports are still alive, you can't kill the Ramattra. You can't focus the Ramattra unless the Ramattra gets naded or something like that. I do think that Zenyatta is probably one of the best supports against Ramattra, especially in a high damage composition, because you can actually kill the Ramattra pretty reliably. And of course, any CC that can get Ramattra out of blocking, because that makes the Ramattra very hard to kill. But these are the big rules and guidelines that I got for you on every single one of these tanks. If you're having trouble beating these tanks or you're losing to these tanks a lot, this is my tips and tricks. But if you have any extra questions, definitely let me know in the comments down below. Hope you enjoyed the video. Smash the like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.